My name is Rajesh Ghai. I am the Research Director for Worldwide Carrier Network Infrastructure Research at IDC. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the multi-access edge compute, or the MEC. So it's been 7 years since HC released its white paper on NFV SDN. Over the past 7 years, you've seen a lot of carriers kind of move towards using NFV SDN in their production environments, away from the lab. 7 years hence, the MEC has emerged as a compelling opportunity for service providers. And what we're going to talk about today is essentially how should service providers think about that compelling opportunity, the investment that they have to make, what kind of things they should consider, and how should they go about making those investments. So what specifically are we going to talk about? We're going to start off by defining what's the carrier multi-access edge. There's been a lot of debate about what the MEC is. In fact, I've been sitting in some sessions and it's kind of taken up half the session. So I'm going to define how we're looking at it. Next, what you're going to do is look at how it fits into the carrier context, how the industry, where the industry is today, and how it kind of helps the industry. After that, what you're going to do is kind of briefly touch upon the business case for the MEC and use all that analysis to kind of develop a strategic framework for evaluating MEC investments from a carrier perspective. Given that I'm from IDC, it would be remiss if I don't leave you with some recommendations, so that will be the last order of the day. Okay, so let's get into it. How are we thinking about the multi-access edge? The way we are looking at it very simplistically is in terms of where it's located. It is an intermediate location between the core data center or traditional data center and connected people and things. So that essentially spans a broad spectrum of locations in a carrier network, starting from the central office to aggregation points to even the cell site towers in some cases, and in the cable context, talking about the hub or the head end. So all those locations potentially could qualify as the MEC. The key thing, in our view, in terms of what the MEC is all about, the two characteristics that define the MEC, one is low latency. So we're talking about latency in the range less than 50 milliseconds and 50 microseconds. And so those kind of latencies that you're talking about. And the other thing that you're interested in, the characteristic that defines the MEC, is the distributed cloud. Not just distributed in terms of the core cloud and the edge cloud, but also the fact that the edge clouds by themselves are distributed and kind of are close to the customers, close to the end users of the data or the content of the processing. And these clouds are obviously federated. They talk to each other, they talk back to the data center, and they also obviously talk back to the customer, which may be a person or a thing. Obviously, things are becoming more important going forward. What is hosted in the edge cloud? There are basically two kinds of infrastructure. One is the carrier's own infrastructure, the access infrastructure. In the case of the mobile network, the local breakout in terms of the user plane function. In the case of a wireline network, the virtual OLT, the virtual BNG, virtual CPE, those kind of infrastructures could be hosted. In the case, and besides that, you obviously have infrastructure, cloud infrastructure that can host applications for third parties, such as enterprises. And we'll come to that, but essentially the two kinds of infrastructure that can be hosted at the MEC, and those are two kinds of what you're talking about. Now, after defining characteristics, let's look at what does the carrier MEC involve. So it involves basically moving processing of the signal of packets closer to the customer, and also moving content and computing associated with third-party apps, which may sit on the MEC closer to the customers. And why do you do it? You do it because you obviously want to reduce latency, but also besides that, you want to reduce the load, the backhaul load back to the core data center. So it kind of is very efficient from a carrier perspective if you can reduce the load on the backbone. Besides that, there are other benefits like security and reliability of the network, and those are all benefits that come from the MEC. In terms of technologies that are going to enable the MEC, obviously we are an SDN NFV world, And it makes a lot of sense that SDN and NFV are, and telco cloud architectures are going to play a key role in this. Besides that, and as the previous speaker talked about automation, that's going to be critical. When you talk about distributed clouds, when you talk about several applications, several infrastructures, automation, orchestration of all those resources in order to address the customer need is going to be absolutely critical and paramount as far as the carrier MEC is concerned. And who's going to be impacted by this? It's going to be a universal impact in terms of consumers, in terms of enterprises, and in terms of carriers themselves. But who's going to pay for it? And that really brings us to the question. This is kind of strategic in the sense of how carrier is going to think about this investment. Is that it's essentially going to be enterprises who are going to pay for that cloud, that premium cloud that sits close to them, and other carriers. Like suppose you could have a wireline carrier lease out space, lease out capacity in the cloud to a mobile network operator in order to host their virtualized RAN or virtualized EPC. So now that we've defined what the MEC is, let's kind of see how the MEC fits into the overall carrier context. So we kind of think about the carrier industry. It's faced with three existential challenges. The first one is commoditization. The fact that they keep investing in capacity and keep investing in their networks, their ARPU, their revenue per bit keeps declining, even though the number of bytes they carry keeps going up. And this is reflected in some data that IDC has collected over the last 20 years. If you look at the last 5 years, from 2014 to 2018, the carrier industry as a whole, globally, saw a decline in revenues from 1.74 trillion to 1.64 trillion. And this is despite the fact that millions of new subscribers have been added to the network, and there has been, obviously, a number of new services that have been launched. Despite all that, revenues have actually declined. And if you look at expenses as a percentage of revenues have actually gone down. So margins are under squeeze because of the fact that there is increased commoditization of services that they offer. The second big issue is competition. Competition not just from other carriers, but also the fact that it is you're seeing increased competition from the hyperscalers, from public cloud, from OTT players, and that is really the existential threat that carriers face today in terms of the new competition. We already know what Rakuten has done, which is kind of come up with a completely disruptive model in Japan. You're probably going to see more such models come up in other geographies, but in general, you've seen the OTT players and the hyperscalers kind of squeeze value out of the carriers over time. And third issue is challenges complexity. The fact that carriers have a rigid infrastructure which does not allow them to innovate, to compete against the new competition is also a big issue that plagues them and continues to hurt them in terms of their ability to innovate. So carriers obviously recognize the need to transform themselves. They understand that they have to make their infrastructure more agile. They need to make the infrastructure more flexible. They obviously, given the margins are under squeeze, they need to become more efficient. And most importantly, what's really important as far as fighting against commoditization, fighting against competition, is that they need to be able to launch new services, introduce new revenue streams in order to fight those bogeys. So that's kind of very important as far as carriers are concerned. That's really what they are trying to do right now is kind of build new services dynamically, fast, in response to the environment. And these are driving the three top mega trends in telco right now. If you look at the three mega trends, the telco cloud, we don't need an introduction to that, in terms of the benefits sought by virtualizing the network, moving to a cloud architecture, in terms of agility and flexibility and efficiency. And I think 5G has been the talk of the town for the last few years, and everybody knows what's that about. And the third trend that's kind of playing out, that's going to become important going forward, is essentially the MEC. And all these mega trends essentially drive towards improving the agility, flexibility, efficiency, and most importantly, drive new service creation. So in fact, the MEC, although it's kind of been something that's just come up in the last few years, has the capability to help the carrier move beyond just connectivity services, which is what they want to do in order to fight commoditization competition, is to kind of have the capability to introduce more services beyond connectivity. And that kind of is important as far as the long-term competitiveness of carriers are concerned against the competition that's coming from the OTT players. So the MEC allows them to create a more attractive alternative for any enterprise to the hyperscale cloud. And most importantly, they also allows it to become, allows them to become a complement to OTT players through CDNs and other video optimization delivery services that could be introduced at the MEC. So, the key thing, one key idea that I want to introduce as far as the interplay between MEC and 5G is about network slicing. So network slicing, as many other speakers have talked about, has the potential to kind of allow a carrier to make their network more customizable, more catering to the needs of each specific customer. And very similar to what happened in the public cloud with virtualization. I think the same thing could happen in the telco network with network slicing, is that you can offer slices tailored to each customer. And the key thing about network slicing is that in order to make network slicing work, the MEC is very important. If you kind of think about the mobile network, the fact that you could move the user plane function of a core network to the cloud, to the MEC, and have it co-resident with an application that sits over there on the MEC, essentially allows the carrier to introduce a new premium service, leveraging the low latency that you have for that particular application at that site. So that's really the key capability that comes up with MEC, and that kind of really enables 5G to become what it is. In the initial iteration, when there's no MEC, it's only going to be essentially enhanced mobile broadband. But if you want to move into low latency services, low latency use cases, the MEC becomes supremely important. One thing I want to say, this is multi-access edge. 5G needs the MEC. The MEC doesn't need 5G. The MEC can still be operational with a fiber. With fiber, in fact, if you think about what CenturyLink in the US has announced, they've talked about the fact that with fiber to their central offices, they could actually reach 95% of the customers with less than 5 millisecond latency, which is awesome. So I would say MEC investments will start even before 5G because you have wireline, service providers that could potentially start investing in the MEC. So we talked about this in terms of MEC is critical to MNOs moving meaningfully beyond consumer, EMBB. And some of these use cases, are over here. I'm not going to call out each one of them, but it's interesting that they span a gamut of industries. And what's also important is that they bring about differentiation along various dimensions. The ones that you have over here: latency, data intensity, connectivity, endpoint density, security, privacy. I think all of these issues come up because of the fact that you have the MEC. And the business case for the MEC for any carrier really depends on the fact that on the value that they can create on a sustainable basis in the long term. The fact that these use cases may look attractive at the beginning, but if you can sustain that value over the next 10, 15 years, then investment makes sense. So that's really the business case that carriers need to think about. But they have two sources of competitive advantage that they didn't have in the past when they looked at public cloud. So when you compare themselves to the situation when they were competing against the hyperscalers in the public cloud, there were two advantages that they have in the MEC which they didn't enjoy. One is real estate. Real estate, in central offices that are close to the customers. Space that they have space in those data centers, in those central offices that could be repurposed for the MEC. The other thing obviously is access, whether it's fiber or whether it's 5G. The carriers control that. So if you kind of combine the two, essentially these are two trends, two advantages that can be used very easily by carriers to essentially have a greater balance of power against the public cloud vendors. A little bit about customers. We talked about this earlier. So I'm not going to repeat everything, what I want to kind of, the key takeaway from this slide essentially is that the business model that we think about for MEC is essentially going to be either B2B or B2B2C. I don't see the consumer becoming a customer of the carrier MEC. The consumer can become a customer of an enterprise that leverages the MEC, very similar to what happens on the public cloud. And I think that simplifies things for the carrier and potentially makes the investment a lot more interesting going forward. So these are internal carrier use cases. You talk about virtualized CO, virtualized CPE. In the case of wireline, in the case of the mobile network, you can talk about virtualized RAN. In the case of cable, virtualized CMTS. And the previous speaker talked about virtualized CDNs. I think that's also an important use case. A lot of carriers are getting into the media business. They will need virtualized CDNs, not just for themselves, but also for third parties. But I think this could be a use case that carriers kind of use themselves for the MEC. Enterprise use cases, again, quite a few. I'm not going to go into each one of them, but essentially a lot of them are enabled by the fact that you have a MEC and low latency access to those applications hosted on the MEC. Since the enterprise has been established as the primary customer of a carrier MEC, it's also important to understand what are the top issues that enterprises think about when they think about edge deployments. So this is from an IDC survey conducted last year, and we asked the enterprises, as to what they thought were the biggest concerns as far as edge deployment were concerned. So cost and the predictability of cost comes out at the top, followed by security. Not very surprising, but it is instructive in terms of how carriers can think about MEC investments going forward, because security is going to be important. Physical security, data security, those are going to be important issues they want to consider. And the fact that cost is important is probably music to the ears of most carriers, given that if they're going to do the heavy lifting in terms of investment, enterprises are probably going to flock to them for the MEC services. So the key thing is that the MEC is not constrained by opportunity. The MEC is constrained by capital. Carriers have only limited capital. They only make less than 5 points of margin on their business. So the ability to invest is going to be quite constrained by capital. So they have to really think deep and hard in terms of how they make the investments in the MEC, what use cases, what geographies. And what's important over here is that they need to consider each use case in isolation and think about a business model around that use case. The reason being, the infrastructure required for each use case in the MEC is going to be different. Some use cases might require accelerated computing. Some might require some extremely sophisticated management and orchestration across different edge clouds. The more important thing is the go-to-market and support. Each use case will have different customers. So if you kind of think about it, go-to-market for each one of those is going to be different. Each use case is going to have, given that customers are different, support requirements are going to be different. So the organization required to sell, support, and actually operate the use case is going to be extremely different for each use case. Even though everyone talks about the MEC as a uniform requirement, it is actually a set of different requirements per use case. So it's kind of important that the carriers, when think about the MEC, think about it in terms of each use case that could potentially drive a business. And also when they kind of think about, so this is kind of the investment framework that you want to think about essentially is that you need to ask yourself questions per use case. And that's very important, and you got to think about all the factors that could impact that use case's business going forward in the next 5 years, whether it's threat from other carriers who are going to build MECs, it's going to be threat from other operators, and it's going to be thinking about what the pricing power is going to be going forward, given the competitive intensity. You got to factor in all of those things and kind of think about the business side of things before investing in the MEC. Last slide, our IDC guidance, the customer guidance. So essentially, what we are saying is that you need to exercise a disciplined approach to a MEC investment. You need to build the MEC, if possible, using cloud-native principles. It's a separate discussion. We're not going to go into that. This is more a business model discussion, but the cloud-native is going to be an important criteria for deciding how you invest. You may have to partner with hyperscalers because there is a capability that's required in terms of managing and operating these distributed clouds. That's not going to be something that's native to carriers, and they may have to partner with some other players, very similar to what AT&T is doing with Microsoft Azure. It's kind of an interesting example. You may have to play an active role in bodies, in the standard bodies. And last but not the least, I think it's very important to start slow. You got to be deliberative, you got to be disciplined, and you got to kind of allow the market to develop before you kind of start investing. So there's market to develop, technology to mature, and I think this is going to be a compelling opportunity. If you're disciplined and deliberate, I think carriers have a good opportunity to make money long term. With that, I will end my talk and take any questions if you have.